Hey guys, my name is Catherine. Thank you for joining me again for another episode of Missing the Missing. In this episode number 23, we're going to be talking about Shane Spiller. Shane Spiller was born between late 1957 and early 1958 in Victoria, Australia. According to Wikipedia, Victoria is the second smallest but second most populous and most densely populated Australian state. It is located in the southeast of Australia, bordered by the Bass Strait and Tasmania to the south, New South Wales to the north, the Tasman Sea to the east, and South Australia to the west, with a population today of over 6.5 million people. A couple of different sources note that his parents are Frank Holden Spiller, an engineer from Armidale, and Daphne Spiller. However, I have been personally unable to verify that information, so I don't know about its veracity. If true, this would mean that Shane had a number of siblings. Lorna, a brother called Victor, who sadly passed away in infancy, and another brother called Barry. Shane was described by an old childhood friend and neighbour as a good-looking, blue-eyed, blonde-haired boy, and by all accounts led a perfectly normal life. That was until one day in July of 1969. Shane was on vacation with his family in Warneet, a small town situated on the coast of Western Port Bay, about 55 kilometres or 35 miles southeast of Melbourne, known for fishing and boating. On the crisp winter day of the 20th of July of 1969, Shane, aged 11 at the time, and his friend Yvonne Tui, aged 12, were on their way to Ski Beach, intending to make a small fire and have a picnic. As they walked along one of the dirt tracks, a man approached the children and, holding a red dagger to her neck, grabbed Yvonne. The man attempted to coax Shane to go with him, but Shane took out a small tomahawk or axe that he had brought along on the trip to cut the firewood with and waved it at him. This prompted the unknown man to threaten, "Put that down or else I'll hurt the girl," and Yvonne pleaded with Shane for help. Shane ran 200 metres through bush and scrubbed back to the road to summon help, shouting as he went, and seeing a car drive past as he did. His friend Yvonne was under a blanket inside the vehicle, and the same unknown male was at the wheel. Shane was able to remember the vehicle, an orange station wagon, and some of its distinguishing characteristics, including a sticker on the rear window, which he drew for police. It was immediately recognised as having a Royal Australian Navy emblem, which led officers investigating the Tui abduction to the HMAS Cerberus Navy base, where they witnessed a man in the laundry room in the process of washing blood from his clothes. The individual initially denied all involvement in the disappearance, though later led investigators to Yvonne's body, which he had left under some bushes on Fisheries Road, Devon Meadows, just 8 kilometres or 5 miles from the site of the abduction. Shane was asked to identify the individual from a police lineup at Russell Street Police Headquarters. Shane remembered afterwards, quote, "What happened stuffed me. I had to pick him. I had to walk up and point right at his nose. The look he gave me. I can still remember it." Tragically, this would be the start of the end for Shane Spiller. As heroic as his actions had been, they had enabled a child murderer to be captured and a shot at justice for his friend and her family. The cost was great and bore heavily on Shane, haunting him for the rest of his days. Robert Reid, former head of the Victoria Police Victim Advisory Unit and Victim Liaison Officer, explained, "For all the world, that was the end of Shane Spiller. That little boy was traumatised for life by what he'd seen." A year later, in 1970, the murderer was convicted, but found not guilty by reason of insanity, though was imprisoned indefinitely either way. Psychiatrists would later find that he was not mentally ill at all, with Professor Paul Mullen stating, "In common with other psychiatrists who have examined him subsequent to his trial in 1970, I can find no evidence suggestive of psychiatric illness." Quote, "I was promised back then that he would never get out," said Shane. "I hope people don't forget what he was like and what he did. They always thought he'd killed others, but they weren't able to prove it," he said. Yvonne's murderer was also identified by a 12-year-old victim as being responsible for her attempted abduction just months prior to Yvonne's, and the same individual is the suspect in the disappearances of 8 other children, those being Christine Sharrock and Marianne Schmidt, both aged 15, who were murdered on Wanda Beach in Sydney in January 1965, the Beaumont children, Jane, 9, Orna, 7, and Grant, 4, who disappeared from Glenelg Beach in Adelaide in 1966. Alan Redston, age 6, murdered in Canberra in 1966. Simon Brooke, age 3, murdered in Sydney in 1968. And Linda Stilwell, age 7, abducted from St Kilda in August of 1968. After the case, Shane returned home and attempted to continue his life. Lawyer Michael Clark explained, "He went back to school after the holiday and seemed to be doing all right. But life as he knew it would never be the same again. He had seen just how brutally, quickly, and unexpectedly it could be taken away, and this left a lasting impression on him. Shane began struggling to sleep and became afraid of the dark. Back then, if you saw something you didn't like, you bit your tongue and took it like a man. He wasn't able to do that," Clark said. He had terrible survivor's guilt, was lonely and afraid. It was clear he had severe post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, but it was never properly diagnosed or treated, having not been understood as well back then as it is now. The effects didn't really catch up to him until he was about 14 or 15, said Clark. Robert Reed remembered Shane fondly, describing him as a, quote, lovable sort of bloke. "He was a knockabout sort of fella," he said, "a wild and woolly little character, very thin, with this big Ned Kelly beard. There wasn't much of him, probably more beard than anything. He was quintessentially a little Aussie bloke from the bush." But that was the facade. Underneath that, he was a shattered individual. He was vulnerable and he was extremely fearful. Beneath the face of Shane Spiller lived a deep and dark cesspool of emotions. End quote. By age 14, Shane started drinking alcohol and began to drift away from school and family. Quote, "He'd been a pretty good student, but very quickly his results went from good to pathetic. He fell out with his parents, left school, and basically went walkabout," explained Clark. His addictions worsened and he fell into the dangerous world of drugs. He carried the fear that his friend's cold-blooded killer would come after him and kill him too, or put out a contract on his life. Quote, "From that time on, he was a wandering, lost soul." Reed added that the killer had absolutely ruined his life. He took a young innocent and turned him into a runaway, and it was him that he was running from. After drifting through much of his life, it is noted that Shane had a son, though again, I've personally been unable to verify this information either. It is therefore unclear whether or not Shane played an active role in his son's life, or what his relationship with his son's mother was like. Either way, Shane found himself in the late 1980s in a small, two-room shack in the small coastal village of Wyndham, New South Wales, located 519 kilometres, 322 miles south of Sydney, in the Bega Valley Shire and Mount Dara ridgeline. Local bartender Peter Cox explained that this is a place where you can be who you like. People mind their own business, but look out for each other. Despite the scenic and tranquil backdrop of sheer granite Jingira rock, Shane couldn't escape his inner demons. He never knew peace or tranquility, couldn't fully appreciate the scenery while the ghosts of his past haunted him wherever he went. Shane slept with a baseball bat next to his bed. He even cut a trap door into his living room floor in case he needed to hide. He recorded the registration numbers of cars driving in his street or parked outside his home, even though, at last count, Wyndham had a population of under 400 residents. Neighbour Andy Morris explained, "He was the most paranoid person I've ever met. There was this overwhelming dark cloud over his life and he was basically self-medicating with drugs and alcohol." His life in Wyndham is remembered and pieced together by the locals who knew him. Shane was a regular at the Robert Burns Hotel and Bar, where he was known as Stick. Bartender Peter Cox remembered that Stick was a nice bloke, he fitted in and everybody accepted him. Even DS Mark Winterflood from Bega Police described him as an unusual sort of bloke who lived on the fringe, was harmless, considerate, and for the most part honest. He was known as a hoarder who was constantly tinkering about in his yard with vehicles and other electronics and mechanics. He had old car parts, washing machines, bike and boat hulls, and was said to have plans to open a laundromat. He was an avid motorcyclist, known for his skill and stunts on his Suzuki GSX 1000. Local Brian Hunter stated, "He was a manic rider. He'd scream past here standing on the seat, arms spread wide. He came off a few times, scraped off a bit of bark, but never really hurt himself." He was a normal bloke in many ways, just a larrikin motorcycle rider who liked a beer and smoked a few cones too many. Speaking of which, Wyndham's location was known to have its share of small cannabis plantations in the surrounding areas, and Shane certainly partook in some cultivating of his own. Shane was also known to have used morphine. There wasn't anything in particular noted as out of the ordinary in the lead up to Shane's disappearance, though of note is that in mid-1998, the killer Shane had helped put behind bars requested a review of his case by the Supreme Court of Victoria, with a view to being released under new laws relating to people serving indefinite sentences. As part of the police's case against his release, Shane was again contacted to give a statement in relation to the matter. Lawyer Michael Clark explained the toll this took on him. It brought back all the memories, and he went into stupefaction again. Robert Reed remembered that he was almost out of control. He was utterly petrified of him. He'd had a wretched life. Then, in the year 2000, Victim Liaison Officer Robert Reed helped Shane to apply for compensation due to the trauma he'd suffered in the aftermath of the murder of his friend Yvonne. He was initially awarded $5,000, though this was increased on appeal to $50,000, the maximum. At the time of his disappearance, Shane Spiller was described as a 44-year-old Caucasian male of thin build. He had blue eyes and greying hair. He was often known to have a bushy beard. Very little is known about the circumstances surrounding Shane's disappearance. On the morning of Monday, the 9th of September 2002, local Wyndham resident Brian Hunter saw Shane leave his home on foot. It is believed he had intended to visit the local store, which was situated just around the corner, to collect his mail. It is unknown if he ever returned. After a few days, neighbours and acquaintances became concerned for his well-being and proceeded to break into his home. Though finding no evidence of his whereabouts, they contacted the police and reported him missing. It is worth noting that one source claims that Shane disappeared in late August of 2002, but the correct date does appear to be the 9th of September. When police received the missing report, they searched Shane's home to find his boots in the middle of the living room. It is not clear whether these were the boots he had been wearing to leave his home on the 9th, and nor therefore, as we've said, is it known whether he made it back home after doing so. It's not been released whether the store owner was spoken to in relation to Shane's attendance that morning, nor if his mail had actually been collected. Of note was that the dining table had been set for two, despite Shane living alone. To date, it is unknown whether it was simply customary for him to set the table for two, or else who Shane had intended to have round for dinner that day. Given that he left in the morning, however, this would seem to suggest that he did indeed make it home to begin preparations for lunch or evening dining. His wallet and medication were found inside the home address, with no sign of anything untoward. His motorcycle was still locked in his shed, and his four-wheel drive was still parked at the front of his premises. Financial investigation showed that he never accessed any of his funds after he disappeared, though it's never been publicly released how much in funding was available in his bank account, as we know that within 2 years prior he had received $50,000 in compensation. We know there was still some money left in the account, as it was reported that Detective Sergeant Mark Winterflood from Bega Police stated, "The bank chipped away at his savings, and when that ran out they foreclosed and took the house," in typical heartless banking fashion. Neighbours joined police in the search using motorbikes and horses. The surrounding area was searched, though to an unknown degree. A flooded old mine shaft at Devil's Hole was drained and searched. Crop farm lookouts were searched, all to no avail. Immigration checks were negative, as were checks with national hospitals. In the years since Shane's disappearance, an individual on Facebook has stated that they believe Shane to be their biological uncle and have begun looking for remaining family members. In August of 2009, a 5-yearly review hearing was conducted in the case of Yvonne Tui's murderer, where SC for the Crown Gavin Silbert suggested that Mr. Spiller may have committed suicide and that an inquest could be held into his suspected death. Yvonne Tui's murderer eventually died from lung cancer almost 44 years to the day after he had abducted and killed her on the 23rd of July 2013, aged 64, having been at the time the longest serving prison inmate in Australia. In April of 2016, Frank Holden Spiller passed away. As we mentioned earlier, some sources note that this individual is Shane's father, though I was unable to verify this. In June 2019, Australia began an annual campaign to feature its missing persons on milk bottles in an attempt to generate leads in the cases. As a result of the inaugural campaign, one of the featured missing persons was located. From June 2020, the campaign will run again. There are three main theories in this case. The first to consider, as usual, is the possibility that Shane's disappearance is self-inflicted, i.e., that he left of his own accord, either to begin a new life elsewhere or to end his life. Addressing the former suggestion, local publican Bernadette Godfrey said, "He was really scared. He told me that one day he might just take off." This is one of the two theories that police also believe is likely to have happened, though acquaintance from the Robert Burns Hotel bar, David Thorogood, disagrees. "Not a hope in hell," he says. "He could have done it 100 times before and he didn't. He didn't want to." Robert Reed, former victim liaison officer, also doubts the suicide theory, explaining, "This was a bloke who talked night after night of killing himself, but it never happened." However, it has been reported that Shane had made 2 previous attempts to kill himself, with the last allegedly being not long before his vanishing, though no further detail as to the timeline is provided. It is stated that he pulled a plastic bag over his head and injected an overdose. He was admitted to a hospital in Bega but checked out after a few days. As we've mentioned, in as early as August of 2009, SC for the Crown Gavin Silbert suggested, at review into the continued detention of Yvonne Tui's murderer, that Mr. Spiller may have committed suicide and that an inquest could be held into his suspected death. However, this doesn't appear to have taken place, and no evidence was released to substantiate the claim for suicide. If Shane took off, he left his finances untouched and didn't take his medication with him, undoubtedly unusual behaviour for an addict, nor did he take his motorcycle, which he loved, or vehicle with him. When discussing the possibility of suicide, considering the methods at Shane's disposal, the most prominent suggestion is an overdose. Many who opt for this method tend to do so in their home or other environment in which they feel comfortable, and Shane wasn't found at home. Also noteworthy is that certain reports, though not all, suggest that the spring months are the most common time of year for individuals to choose suicide. In the Southern Hemisphere, September would fit the season. Moving on, we have the possibility of an accident having occurred. There are a number of situations that may fit this scenario. As we know, Australia, and especially locations not necessarily overrun with footfall and traffic, are home to a number of poisonous critters, more populous there than in many other countries. It is possible that Shane went hiking or for a walk and was bitten by a snake or spider, or even that he may have had a fall in the Shire or on the ridgeline, though it's not known whether he was known to go hiking. Another possibility, being the second most prominent theory in the minds of the authorities, is that Shane may have had an accidental overdose. If this were the case, however, it would appear that there was third-party involvement, at the very least, to remove the body and/or evidence. This is a point we need to consider for all the theories we've discussed so far, the question of where his body ended up. It clearly didn't move itself post-death, so without assistance, I'd like to think it would have been found by now. Robert Reed stated, "If I was honest with my emotions and my intuition, I'd have to say I don't believe he killed himself. Something else happened to him." However, it has been suggested that, due to the small size of the village and its community, if someone was involved, word would have gotten out sooner rather than later. That is, unless those involved left the area and weren't close to the locals. Enter a 38-year-old violent criminal who'd served time in prison. Not long after his last release, near 2000, he ended up in Wyndham. Coincidentally, the same year Shane would be awarded his compensation. He was known to scare some of the locals, but was seen to be spending time with Shane and at his home. He was described as a bad egg with black, empty eyes. Apparently when he went to the bar looking for Shane, the bartender said, "If ever I've seen evil, it's just walked into the bar." In August of 2000, he and a friend borrowed Shane's Nissan that he'd bought out of his compensation and wrecked it after a night of drinking. Just 2 days later, the two had another night of drinking with another friend, Lee Mick Petrie, who by the end of that night would find himself stabbed to death. Detective Sergeant Mark Winterflood explained, "The murder was 3 drunks in a room. Their alcohol readings were all around the 2.5 level. One described himself as virtually paralytic. One of them winds up dead, and the other 2 can't really remember what happened. But they are able to shove a plastic bag over his head, drive him to a lookout on Myrtle Mountain, pull him out of the back of a car, and dump him there." The 38-year-old admitted to killing Petrie, but went on to say that he deserved to die. He was sentenced to a minimum 15-year term, while the other culprit admitted to being a witness. It was reported that while he was awaiting release on bail, his house was burgled. Winterflood said, "They've stolen his tools, his washing machine, anything of value. And one of the people he blames is poor old Spiller." We do know that Shane was known to tinker around with washing machines and was wanting to open a laundromat, though there was no evidence to suggest that he had any involvement in the incident whatsoever. However, the aggrieved individual arranged for Shane to be threatened with a gun, which was known to send his paranoia and fear into overdrive, understandably. One local resident said of Shane, "He was always saying someone was after him. No one knows what happened to him." While DS Mark Winterflood confirmed that he didn't pick his friends very well, and people took advantage of him. Another Victorian police source suggested that Shane had been killed for its compensation payout. The table was set for 2 that afternoon, and all of Shane's items were left behind. Given the sudden appearance of a violent criminal to the area in the aftermath of Shane's monetary award, the convenient hanging around and using of Shane's property, or vehicle, as his own, this would seem to me to be quite a plausible theory, if we only knew what was left in his bank and wallet. But sadly, we may never know what happened to Shane on the 9th of September 2002 in Wyndham, Australia. In this section, I'd like to draw your attention to a ray of light I encountered during my research into this case. An organisation called Picking Up the Pieces, reading from their website. 1.4 million Australians at any one time have post-traumatic stress disorder, from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. That equates to 6.4% of 21.5 million Australians. PTSD affects people from all walks of life. Families can be torn apart, drug and alcohol problems can occur, careers are destroyed, and in some cases, people are driven to suicide as a way of stopping the psychological and physical pain and anguish. Picking Up the Pieces is a non-profit organisation committed to raising awareness about the detrimental effects of stigma and the signs and symptoms of PTSD, and how, by seeking intervention early, sufferers and their families can regain some functionality and an improved quality of life. This is a really good cause, which will be helping thousands of sufferers of PTSD and their loved ones. They have educational resources and advice available on their website, and I would urge anybody who feels like they could benefit from their service to contact them. The details will be in the description box below. I'd like to leave you now with a repeat of Shane's description and some final words from friends. At the time of his disappearance, Shane Spiller was described as a 44-year-old Caucasian male of thin build. He had blue eyes and greying hair. He was often known to have a bushy beard. If seen today, Shane would be almost 62 years old. Shane's story has touched the hearts of many internationally. He had a traumatic event occur in his childhood that he was unable to completely recover from. The tragedy haunted him for the rest of his days, but his bravery is remembered by those close to him as well as by strangers touched by his courage. Robert Burns' bartender Peter Cox is quick to highlight the good Shane did in his life, quote, "He was a very clever boy. Look what he did way back then. If it wasn't for stick, that bloke could still be killing people." Neighbour Andy Morris added, "To me, he was a very brave man. I like to picture him lying in a hammock with a banana daiquiri. That'd be heaven to stick. But wherever he is, I just hope he's happy at last." Megan from Facebook said, "What an amazing boy he was. He saved others from being killed. So not fair that his life was tortured by the experience. He does deserve happiness at the very least." With Sharon, also from Facebook, agreeing, "He was a little boy hero." And another touching comment from an unknown individual confirming, "He didn't deserve what happened to him, but he does deserve to be remembered. Here." Neighbour Andy Morris summed things up in a sobering and sombre sentence. In a sense, Shane was a murder victim as well. If you have any information relating to the disappearance of Shane Spiller, please use the contact details in the description box below to get it to those who can act on it. So thank you for taking some time out of your day to listen to me and Shane's case. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you next time. Bye.